A woman with perfect French diction, a glowing humanitarian record, and VIP access to Burkina Faso's most sensitive zones is suddenly handcuffed by President Ibrahim Traoré himself in front of cameras. But what's shocking isn't the arrest. It's what she whispers into Traoré's ear and how he reacts. She's no ordinary spy. She knows something. Something that could unravel not just France's grip on the Sahel, but Traoré's entire moral compass. Claire Morrow stepped off the plane in Ouagadougou like a woman already home. Sunlight glinted off her ID badge marked with the seal of a Paris-based NGO known for post-conflict trauma work. Within days, she was visiting field hospitals, handing out medicine in remote villages, and speaking Mossi with such native fluency that elders paused mid-sentence, stunned. Soldiers called her the French woman with a Burkina Faso soul. Children clung to her scarf, and widows wept in her arms. She blended seamlessly, too seamlessly. She was granted access to zones usually locked to outsiders. Military wives welcomed her into their kitchens. Wounded officers spoke to her more freely than to their own chaplain. When a battalion suffered heavy losses near the northern border, Claire was already there, comforting survivors before the Red Cross arrived. And yet, behind the charm and charity, shadows whispered. No one could say where she was born. Her NGO file listed a birthplace as Lyon, but the French embassy had no matching birth certificate. The Minister of Interior requested a full background check. The response came 3 weeks late and redacted. One evening during tea in a colonel's compound, a wife spoke softly. Claire had visited them just 2 days before a failed assassination attempt. Coincidence? They all agreed. But another wife across the courtyard went pale. Captain Yarrow, head of domestic intelligence and an old friend of President Traoré, began watching her. What he found wasn't damning. It was worse. Claire wasn't hiding something. She was erasing it. No past, no traceable record beyond polished smiles and press photos. When Yarrow slid the file onto the president's desk, Traoré said nothing. But for the first time in months, he canceled his meetings. Claire Morrow now had his full attention. It started with the raid near Arbinda. A rebel commander known only as Muhammad had evaded capture for 2 years. His encampment, tucked deep in the forest and known only to a handful of insiders, was reduced to ash by a precision airstrike just 4 days after Claire Morrow's humanitarian team delivered food and antibiotics. No one questioned it. Rebels die. That's war. But then it happened again. A shelter outside Jibo housing displaced nomads, many suspected of harboring fighters, was flattened by drone fire less than a week after Claire arrived with trauma kits and solar radios. Locals said she smiled warmly, asked about tribal customs, took pictures. The photos never showed up online. Captain Yarrow connected the dots late one night, sifting through mission logs and satellite images. Every site Claire visited ended up compromised. Not always destroyed, but exposed. Rebel groups who had hidden for years suddenly found themselves outflanked, targeted, eliminated. Yet she always walked away unscathed. Not once had her convoy been attacked. Not once had she needed extraction. At first, the assumption was a leak in military communications. But encrypted networks held firm. No breaches, no bugs. Then came the realization that chilled even Yarrow. What if the leak wasn't technical? What if the intel wasn't stolen, but given? Claire's laptop, her satellite phone, her tablet, all allowed under NGO clearance, could quietly transmit geolocation data without triggering suspicion. Her presence wasn't a risk. It was the bait, the perfect Trojan horse masked as empathy. The sun was already sinking over Dory when the ambush hit. A military convoy transporting wounded soldiers from a skirmish near the Niger border was blown apart just outside the city's edge. The route had been classified. Only 4 people knew the timing, and Claire Morrow had met with 2 of them earlier that morning, bringing supplies, checking names, asking detailed questions under the guise of coordination. Alzheimer's Association, coordination. Captain Yarrow stood over the wreckage that night, the scent of diesel and blood still thick in the air. A young lieutenant's body lay crumpled against a tree, his hand still clutching a radio. Yarrow's jaw tightened. He didn't need orders anymore. The pattern wasn't a pattern. It was a signature. Yarrow brought the findings to President Traoré in silence. Traore didn't look up from the map on his desk. His fingers traced the next likely target. Claire was already scheduled to visit it. His voice, when it finally came, was razor thin. Pull surveillance from her hotel. I want to know who she calls at night. Claire, of course, was unharmed. She had left Dory an hour before the attack, citing unforeseen scheduling changes. Her driver confirmed the alibi. So did the hotel. But her satellite phone pinged just 5 kilometers from the site 15 minutes before the bombs went off. President Traoré received the report in his private quarters. He didn't speak. Instead, he paced the tiled floor of his residence in silence, eyes narrowed, voice buried somewhere deep behind clenched teeth. Claire's face was on the cover of a French magazine on his desk. An Angel in Africa, the headline read. He flipped it over. Later that night, Yarrow waited by the compound gates as Traoré emerged. Jacket in hand, eyes like steel. He didn't bring his ministers, no press, no convoy. Just Yarrow and a decision heavy enough to shift the course of a nation. She moves again, Traoré said, stepping into the jeep. We follow. And as the engine roared to life, Yarrow asked the question that had haunted them both for days. Do we arrest her for what she's done or for who sent her? Bobo Dioulasso Airport pulsed with its usual chaos. Vendors shouting, luggage carts rattling, foreign aid workers shuffling through security in pressed linen shirts. Claire Merrill moved calmly through the terminal, scarf tucked neatly over her shoulder, passport in hand. She smiled at the guard who waved her through priority clearance, unaware, pretending not to be that 2 plainclothes officers were trailing her every step. Captain Yarrow stood in a maintenance corridor overlooking Gate 3, earpiece in, watching through tinted glass. President Traoré waited in a black SUV outside the terminal, engine running, his silence stretching like wire. The team had orders, no noise, no spectacle. But when Claire's suitcase went through inspection, the mood changed instantly. The customs officer paled. Inside the lining, a folded satellite uplink, military-grade encryption chip, and a badge, UN Blue. But the seal was wrong. Fake. The materials were too clean, too perfect, not humanitarian, intelligence. Yarrow moved fast. Now, he said into his mic. Claire had just reached the boarding ramp when she was stopped. One man blocked the passage. Another took her arm. She didn't resist, didn't panic, just turned her head slowly and locked eyes with Yarrow as he approached. This is a mistake, she said softly, almost amused. Then came the moment no one expected. Traoré stepped out of the SUV, crossed the tarmac alone, and walked directly to her. No guards, no press, just the president of the transition, staring down a woman the world believed to be a saint. She leaned in, her voice barely audible. You're not the only one who's been betrayed. Traoré froze, her breath still warm on his cheek. For a full second, the air around them thickened with something unspoken. Then his voice, flat and final, take her in, alive. Claire sat in the holding room beneath the presidential compound, her hands unshackled, her eyes sharp. The walls were bare concrete, the air stale, the silence deliberate. She hadn't asked for a lawyer, she hadn't asked for anything, she just waited. Captain Yarrow watched her from behind the mirrored glass, unease crawling under his skin. Traoré had ordered no interrogation, not yet, just observation. But it wasn't the spycraft that unsettled Yarrow. It was her calm, her certainty, as if this arrest was always part of her plan. President Traoré entered without ceremony. No security, no press, just him, a folder under his arm and the weight of a nation in his gaze. Claire looked up, folding her hands as if greeting a guest. You've been busy, he said, dropping the folder onto the table. Photos spilled out, burned convoys, bombed villages, intercepted calls, satellite coordinates. Her trail mapped like a crime scene. She glanced down, then back up. You know those weren't my decisions, she replied. Traoré leaned in. Then whose were they? Claire didn't answer. Instead, she pulled a thin envelope from her sleeve and slid it across the table. Yarrow stiffened behind the glass. Traoré opened it. Inside were photographs, grainy but clear, of a secret meeting between a French oil executive, a Sahelian rebel leader, and a man wearing the insignia of a European peacekeeping unit. "You were never the target," Claire said, voice low. "You were the pawn." Traoré's jaw clenched. The pieces were shifting. She wasn't just feeding intelligence to Paris. She was unraveling it and maybe, just maybe, trying to burn it down. He stared at her for a long moment, then quietly asked the question that had haunted him for weeks. "Why me?" Claire exhaled. "Because you're the only one they didn't expect to survive." The envelope didn't leave Traoré's sight for the next 12 hours. He locked it in a steel drawer, dismissed his aides, and summoned only one person, Colonel Fawana, Chief of Counterintelligence, a man who owed him loyalty from the trenches, not the palace halls. By sunrise, a second dossier lay open on the presidential desk. This one thicker, older, dirtier. It wasn't Claire Morrow who was rogue. It was the mission she'd infiltrated. Leaked communications between the French defense attaché and executives from a Paris-based energy consortium detailed covert operations designed to destabilize the Sahel. The goal: force, resource, starve governments into lopsided mining contracts in exchange for military assistance. The rebels weren't just tolerated, they were assets. Controlled chaos. And Claire, embedded to monitor the rebels, yes, but also to gather proof. Not for France, for herself, for someone else. One document stood out. A transfer manifest for surveillance drones signed not by French officials, but a European Union humanitarian delegate. Traoré recognized the name. He'd shaken the man's hand in Brussels, smiled for photos. Claire had been feeding multiple channels. The question now wasn't whether she was a spy. It was whose spy. Later that afternoon, Traoré stood alone in the marble hallway outside the cell. His hand hovered over the handle. Inside sat a woman who had lied, manipulated, and infiltrated his country at its most fragile points. And yet she might have just handed him the map to the real battlefield, the one beneath the surface, where pipelines and proxy wars bled Africa dry while the West sold peace on paper. He opened the door. Claire didn't flinch. "You read the last page," she said. Traoré nodded slowly. "They're not coming to rescue you, are they?" She smiled faintly. "They're coming to silence us both." Night had settled thick over Koudougou when Traoré called his most trusted men to a silent council. No ministers, no aides, just Colonel Fawana, Captain Yarrow, and an unmarked man from military intelligence whose name was never written down. The room was dim, the table bare. On it sat only the envelope Claire had handed him, and a tablet displaying satellite feeds, names, dates, and grainy footage too damning to ignore. "She gave us the thread," Traoré began. "The question is whether we pull it." The implications were enormous. If the documents were real and every test so far said they were, France had not only financed insurgent activity, but strategically sacrificed Burkinabe soldiers for profit margins and regional leverage. The oil deals, the drone strikes, the aid convoys saw puppeteered beneath the illusion of partnership. Fawana wanted retaliation. "We go public. We burn them with the truth. Let the world see what France really is in this region." But Yarrow shook his head. "We burn them, they burn her. They'll deny everything, discredit her, frame her as a double agent. Then they'll destabilize us again harder." The unnamed man spoke last. "Or we use it quietly. Take the intel, flip it, set traps, forge new alliances, make them think we're still in the dark." Traoré stared at the flickering screen. On it, one file blinked red. An upcoming peace conference in Accra where key French envoys would appear. If they exposed France there, it could rupture diplomatic ties across West Africa. But it could also unleash open warfare in the shadows. He looked toward the cell block where Claire waited, then back at the men. "We don't just survive this," he said. "We make sure no president after me ever has to beg for sovereignty." And with that, the war shifted underground. The road to Djibo was narrow, broken, and watched. Every turn passed under the eyes of men who didn't wear uniforms but carried weapons like second skin. Claire sat in the back of a camouflage convoy, flanked by 2 intelligence officers. No cuffs, just silence. President Traoré had made his choice. He would gamble not on her innocence but on her information. The convoy reached an abandoned cotton warehouse 2 kilometers outside Djibo. To anyone passing by, It looked like a ruin swallowed by sand. But beneath it, through a hidden trapdoor cloaked in straw and rusted barrels, lay a command nodes mall, cold and packed with tech not available in West Africa. Claire led them in. Inside, computers hummed softly. A wall of screens displayed drone footage, thermal maps, and intercepted communications. The operators weren't rebels. They were children. Some no older than 15, some missing fingers, others with blank stares and French on their tongues. They worked without speaking, trained to observe, report, and forget. In the corner, two men were bound white, silent and terrified. One wore the insignia of a French private military contractor. The other, a satellite technician for an NGO no one had heard of, with an EU diplomatic pass in his pocket. Traoré stepped into the bunker last, his face unreadable. He took in the scene: the mercenaries, the boys, the French tech, marked with humanitarian logos, and let the silence stretch. Claire stood beside him. "This is what they build when no one's watching," she said. Yarrow's voice broke through. "And what do we do now?" Traoré didn't answer. Instead, he turned toward the children, his voice low. "We bring the world here. We make them look." And just like that, exposure became his greatest weapon. The broadcast wasn't flashy. No national anthem, no podium, no flags, just President Traoré seated at a wooden table in a quiet room, a single folder in front of him. The camera went live at 8 a.m. across West Africa, and by noon, the world was watching. Traoré spoke in measured tones. He didn't name France directly, but the documents he displayed on screen contracts, intercepted emails, drone schematics, photos of child informants made it impossible to misinterpret. A French energy giant, European peacekeepers, Western-backed insurgents, all tied to operations in Burkina Faso meant to destabilize, manipulate, and extract. Then he did what no one expected. He introduced Claire Morrow, not as a traitor, but as a witness. Her face pale, her posture calm, she read a short statement. She admitted to espionage. She admitted to infiltration. But she claimed she broke protocol the moment she saw children being used as disposable tools of war. "I was sent to gather intel," she said, voice steady, "but I stayed to expose the system that trained me." International networks scrambled. The French Foreign Ministry denied everything. EU officials demanded clarification. Protests flared in Paris and Lyon. African leaders, some cautious, others emboldened, called for a pan-African tribunal. In Ouagadougou, people flooded the streets, not in anger, but in awe. For the first time in decades, a leader had turned the game upside down, not by begging, not by hiding, but by showing the truth and letting the world flinch. When the broadcast ended, Traoré left the room alone. No follow-up statement, no victory speech. In the silence that followed, one message rang louder than all the noise. Burkina Faso was no longer anyone's pawn, and for the first time, the players knew it. Claire Morrow disappeared the next morning. No motorcade, no flight manifest, no guards trailing her footsteps. One moment, she was in the custody of Burkinabe intelligence. The next, her cell was empty, its only trace a folded note left on the cot. Truth is never safe. President Traoré said nothing. When asked at a press briefing, he simply looked into the cameras and replied, "She gave us the key. That's all that matters." Behind the scenes, global tensions churned. France withdrew several envoys under the pretext of security reevaluation. Aid agencies quietly relocated. But across West Africa, something else took root. In Mali, in Niger, in Chad, young leaders began citing Traoré's speech not just as a moment of defiance, but as a template for sovereignty. Intelligence sharing shifted. Old alliances cracked. New ones formed under the table. And in Ouagadougou's dusty markets, the people didn't talk about diplomatic fallout. They talked about the children in Djibo, the footage of scared boys surrounded by wires and war, about a French woman who had vanished after exposing her own nation's hand. But most of all, they talked about Traoré, how he hadn't blinked when he pulled the curtain back, even knowing the storm it would bring. In the military barracks, graffiti began appearing, not a pawn. On school walls, they used our silence. Now we speak. And in whispers passed between elders and vendors, a question endured, not in fear, but in wonder. How many more truths live in shadows, waiting for one man to bring them into light? Because while the world debated sanctions and denials, in Burkina Faso, one truth had already taken root. The game had changed. And this time, it was Africa that dealt the first move. If this story opened your eyes, hit that like button and subscribe for more powerful untold truths from Africa's front line of justice. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a story the world tries to silence. What would you have done in President Traoré's place? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one. Share this video if you believe the world needs to hear the truth behind the headlines. Your voice matters. Let's make it echo.